When a Challenger 600 lost both engines just seconds from landing in Naples, the crew had barely over a minute to act. Two experienced pilots gave their lives trying to save everyone on board. The NTSB hasn't released the final report yet, but the investigation docket is out. Hundreds of pages of technical findings, interviews, and data. And it finally sheds light on what really went wrong. We're talking about shocking corrosion inside both engines, overlooked warning signs, and a maintenance culture that's raising some very tough questions. Let's check it out. So, let's start with the flight itself, because the context matters. The jet was a Bombardier Challenger 604, registration November 823 Kilo Delta, flying for Hoppa Jet, a Part 135 charter operator. On board were two highly experienced pilots, Captain Edward Murphy, age 50, and First Officer Ian Hoffman, age 65. Alongside them was a young flight attendant, Sidney Bosmans, and two passengers, Aaron Baker and Audra Green. They were on approach into Naples, Florida, just a few miles from safety, when the unthinkable happened. Both engines quit. Losing one engine in a jet is serious, but losing both at low altitude is basically the nightmare scenario. With no power and very little time, the crew aimed for I-75, the highway running just outside the airport, as their last chance. The aircraft clipped a barrier, hit the ground hard, and erupted in flames. Tragically, both pilots were killed in the crash. But here's the remarkable, almost unbelievable part. The flight attendant, both passengers, and even a motorist on the highway all survived with only minor injuries. Those pilots absorbed the full impact trying to save others. And I think it's fair to call them heroes for that. The cockpit voice recorder makes this even more haunting. You can hear the captain trying to restart the engines, the first officer wrestling with the reality of a forced landing, and the flight attendant giving a firm, chilling, brace command just before impact. It's a raw glimpse into how quickly everything unfolded. Now here's where the newly released docket really changes our understanding. For months, people speculated about fuel contamination or some kind of crew mistake. But the NTSB's technical findings point to something very different, and honestly, pretty shocking. Both engines, GE CF34-3B, showed severe corrosion and binding inside the variable geometry inlet guide vanes, or VGV. These are small but critical components that sit in the front section of the compressor. Think of them like adjustable blinds or shutters that angle airflow into the engine. At idle or low power, they shift to stabilize airflow. At higher power, they open up to maximize thrust. If they work smoothly, you never even think about them. But if they get stuck, the airflow goes haywire. Instead of smooth compression, the engine can stall, sputter, or flat out shut down. And in this case, investigators found the Stage 5 vane system so corroded and stiff that it took excessive force just to move them. That's a huge red flag. And exactly the kind of condition that can lead to a compressor stall and flameout. And here's the critical takeaway. This wasn't a fuel issue. It wasn't mismanagement by the crew. This was a mechanical and maintenance-linked failure, and these engines had been quietly deteriorating inside until one day, the wrong day, they both gave out at the same time. And that's extremely rare in aviation, and that's why this case is drawing so much attention. This is where the story gets really crazy, and honestly, frustrating. According to the docket, these engines had been bolted to this airplane since the day it rolled out of the factory in 2004. Nearly 20 years, almost 9,700 hours, without ever being removed. That's not illegal, by the way. Engines are designed to stay on wing for a long time. But in this case, with this environment, it raises big questions. Because this Challenger wasn't based in Kansas or Colorado. It lived most of its life in Florida, a place airline mechanics jokingly call Corrosion Corner. The salty, humid air down there is brutal on airplanes. Metal doesn't just sit still, it corrodes, seizes, and slowly turns against you if you're not constantly fighting back with maintenance. Now, GE, the maker of these CF34 engines, has been pretty clear about what operators should do in these environments. They recommend freshwater rinses and engine washes every 200 to 400 hours when flying near saltwater. Think of it like flushing out the salt before it eats away at the moving parts. But the records for November 823 Kilo Delta show something else. HoppaJet was stretching those washes to about 800 hours. That's double the upper limit of the recommendation. And when you add up years of Florida humidity with skipped or stretched washes, corrosion doesn't just creep in, it takes over. Even worse, this jet had a history of what mechanics call hung starts. That's when the engine starts to spool up, but can't quite reach idle RPM on its own. It's an early warning sign that something in the airflow system is binding or sticking. And sure enough, those hung starts were logged as recently as a few weeks before the crash. On paper, corrective action was taken, but given what investigators later found inside the engines, you've got to wonder, were these early cries for help from a machine that was literally seizing up inside? And here's the uncomfortable truth. This was a Part 135 charter operation. The rules are strict, but the culture is not the same as a big airline. Airlines under Part 121 have armies of mechanics, layers of oversight, and auditors crawling over their maintenance programs. In Part 135, operators often run leaner. Fewer eyes, fewer checks, and sometimes a mentality of good enough when it comes to following manufacturer guidance to the letter. Was this just one company cutting corners? Or is it a symptom of a broader gap between charter oversight and airline-level standards? That's the million-dollar question. Now, to really understand how rare this is, let's put it in perspective. Dual-engine flameouts just don't happen in modern aviation unless something extraordinary occurs. Take U.S. Airways Flight 1549, the Miracle on the Hudson. That was a flock of geese tearing through both engines. British Airways Flight 38 at Heathrow, that was ice crystals clogging the fuel oil heat exchangers. Both were freak events, not systemic maintenance issues. But here's the thing, the CF34 engine family itself has seen problems before. Investigators have documented cases of hung starts and shutdowns linked to these very same variable stator vanes. Other operators discovered seized or binding vanes, and when they dug inside, they found the same culprit, corrosion. So, while dual flameouts are rare, the warning signs in this case were not unprecedented. And here's where smaller charter fleets face a unique risk. Airlines move their jets around the world. One week they're flying over the Rockies, the next over the Atlantic. That variety prevents one type of wear from piling up too much. But a charter jet based year-round in Florida, it's breathing salt every single day. If maintenance isn't aggressive enough to counter that, you get a perfect storm of neglect and environment. That's why this accident forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. Are we underestimating the risks of salt corrosion flameouts in these smaller business jet and charter fleets? It's easy to write off corrosion as just another maintenance issue, but this case shows it can be a direct path to catastrophe. And if investigators are right, this wasn't bad luck. It was a predictable outcome of a predictable problem. The good news, if there's any, is that the industry is now taking this very seriously. In the months after the crash, GE issued a special service bulletin. It required operators who'd had hung starts in the last 24 months to inspect their variable geometry systems. Basically, to go in and check for binding or seized vanes. The results were jaw-dropping. Out of 34 engines inspected, 7 failed, and 4 of those 7 came from HoppaJet, the very same operator of N823KD. That tells you this wasn't just an unlucky one-off. This was a systemic problem waiting to surface. As a result, the industry is now rethinking its maintenance playbook. More frequent freshwater rinses, more aggressive engine washes, one-time compressor inspections, and importantly, closer scrutiny from regulators. Because corrosion isn't going away, especially in places like Florida and Miami, which, not coincidentally, sits in one of the highest-rated severe corrosion zones in North America. Now, the NTSB hasn't published its final report yet, The docket gives us the evidence, but not the official conclusions. Still, the writing's on the wall. And the most haunting detail of all comes from the cockpit voice recorder. Just before impact, the first officer mutters, "This damn airplane." It's a line that hits like a gut punch, because it's not just frustration in the moment. It feels like a verdict. Like he knew deep down this wasn't a freak accident, but the end of a long chain of missed opportunities and overlooked maintenance. At the end of the day, these two pilots gave their lives to protect their passengers and even people on the ground. They're being remembered as heroes, and rightfully so. But the bigger takeaway here is this: their sacrifice is a warning. If corrosion and maintenance culture aren't taken seriously, we're going to see this happen again. And that's the last thing anyone in aviation wants to admit. So what do you think? Is this a one-off case of poor maintenance, or does it expose a bigger oversight problem in the charter world? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and make sure you're subscribed, because when the NTSB final report comes out, we'll break it down right here.